yellow cross on it as a way of entrapping the owner, because if the owner had checked the bag in Brisbane with no drugs in there, and then they suddenly get to Bali and there's a yellow cross on it, denoting a suspicious bag, they might think, well, hang on, I better leave that bag alone because the customs have found something in it, even though there shouldn't have been something in it.
So this is the whole thing. I think in a way we're sort of looking, we're sort of doing an injustice in a way with the whole argument. I know that's sort of what you have to do because people are asking all these dumb questions. The fact that the handle of the bag was cut, it completely wipes it out as evidence to me because it's been tampered with. The fact that we haven't got any weight, we haven't got any testing of the drugs, we haven't got any chain of custody. The case for Corby, from what I can see, there's nothing really that proves the case. They've got a prima facie case because the drugs are in her bag. But there's nothing else, is there? There's just smear and BS.
You're not actually quite correct there. Having the drugs in her bag did not represent a prima facie case. They needed some additional evidence to make it a prima facie case.
Okay.
Forensically testing the drugs to prove that they came from Brisbane would have given them a prima facie case. And
because the bag's out of her control during that trip, yeah, that consequently negates the prima facie case unless they can prove the drugs are there before transportation.
Well, that's exactly right. Now, if you are correct, and I'm not saying you're not correct, that the drugs were inserted in Brisbane for transportation to Sydney, when they finally got to Bali, it would have represented a genuine case of importation, transnational drug importation into Bali, and they would have then given the police the freedom to conduct a full and proper investigation into the whole thing, which would have included weighing the bag. Testing for fingerprints, forensic testing the drugs to prove that they came from Brisbane, and that would have given the prosecution a prima facie case and more than sufficient secondary evidence to put Schapelle away, but they did none of those things.
So how could they convict her then? How were they able to convict her? Because you're saying they didn't have a prima facie case.
Well, basically, they had the primary evidence, which was the marijuana in her bag, and by way of secondary evidence, they eventually used testimony. It was all they had, the testimony of the customs officer at the main desk, the testimony of a second customs officer who was in the customs room that the bag was eventually taken to, and two police officers in the airport who claim that they heard Schapelle say she owned the marijuana, and also claim that they saw her trying to push Winata's hand away when he tried to open the bag. It was all basically testimony. The two police officers who said that they confirmed that Gusti's testimony that Schapelle had admitted owning the marijuana couldn't speak English. Gusti Winata himself, his command of English was so poor that he actually used an interpreter in court. And he testified in court that Schapelle had admitted the bag was hers and admitted that the marijuana was hers. And yet, funnily enough, when he first asked James if the bag was his and Schapelle said, no, it's mine, he then leads James away. Ultimately, James got led away with the bag, and Schapelle was left in the airport free to leave if she wished. Now, if his command of the English language was so good that he was quite certain that Schapelle had admitting owning the bag and the marijuana, why did he then lead James away into another room and leave Schapelle basically free to go if she wished?
It's alarming, isn't it? I tell you what, do what I've done. Get on schapelle.net and sign these petitions that are there, because this is just ridiculous. It's politicised. It's got nothing to do with her guilt at all, has it, Roy?
Yeah, no, it hasn't. And the other thing I really need to point out is that although you say that my theory that the drugs were inserted in Bali is a theory, and I admit that it is, it seems that the Balinese police were very determined to make sure that the origin of the drugs was never ever established. They refused to forensically test it. They refused to allow the Australian Federal Police a sample for testing. And then they ultimately burnt the evidence, the drugs and the bag and the boogie board, all untested for country of origin, even before her appeals process was complete.
Right.
Now,
well,
something like that when testing the evidence and proving that it was for Brisbane would have done their case so much good.
Okay, that is. I mean, from our point of view, I guess from our legal system, that just sounds like miscarriage of justice right there.
She wouldn't have been charged in Australia, would she, Roy?
Well, she may have been charged with possession, but she wouldn't have been charged with. I mean, they say she imported the drugs, and yet they never proved the drugs were Australian. So how can they say she imported them if they didn't actually prove that they were Australian? They also charged her with trafficking And yet they did no investigation in Bali whatsoever to establish how Schapelle intended to dispose of these drugs once she'd got them through. They never questioned a single person. They never presented a single piece of evidence in court to support the trafficking charge, and yet she was still found guilty of trafficking, which essentially added another 10 years to her sentence.
Look, I just want to emphasise for our listeners that, you know, in any kind of case like this, all the facts are always complicated and there's always a lot of grey areas. But I see something pretty clear, something pretty crystal clear, and you've sometimes got to just clear away all of that foggy stuff because it's irrelevant. What is relevant and important is whether or not there was enough information to convict her under a basic legal system. We have to use our legal system as a reference here, and I'd say under our legal system clearly there wasn't. Maybe under the Indonesian legal system there was, but and all these things basically come down to the law basically operates on these very, strict principles, and there just wasn't enough evidence there to, under our terms, prove anything other than that it was in the bag when she opened the bag. Okay, so let's just really get that clear, because I do want to get into some of the other issues that have cropped up to do with allegations that her family was involved in drugs, etc. But before we do that, and I want to give Roy a chance to sort of clear all that up as well. But before I do that, I want to play a song, which is by the title of the song is "When You Tried to Tell the World." And can you give me the name of the person, Roy? I can't see it on here on YouTube.
Holly
I've got
Wilson.
YouTube up. Holly Wilson. Yeah, okay. I'm just about to play the song by Holly Wilson. So we'll just kick that off and we'll get right back.